As morbid as it seems to us today, the homes of the Roman nobility were decorated with the death masks of prominent ancestors. These wax figures had been molded from the very faces of their forebears and filled the household shrines to the glory of the family, which reminded every boy what was expected of him. He was to bring honor to the family, the clan, and the state by accomplishing great things that secured eternal glory, not just for the individual, but for all of his descendants. This lust for glory being bred into Romans from their very first breath was a driving force behind the seemingly limitless ambition of the Republican era, when men like Marcellus, Scipio, and Pompey dramatically expanded the boundaries of Roman territory and secured the Republic's rule over the entire Mediterranean. Once, when passing through a small Alpine town, Caesar famously stated that he would rather be the first man in this tiny hamlet than the second man in Rome. This was the importance that the nobility placed on their own dignity and their historical legacy. Many Romans would therefore be happy to know that their names continue to echo throughout history. But who is actually the most famous Roman to have ever lived? A statesman like Augustus? A scholar like Cicero? Or a philosopher king like Marcus Aurelius? The irony is that it's none of these luminaries of Rome that has emerged as her most famous son, someone who is known by name by more people than any other Roman, and will likely continue to resonate through history for much longer than any of his countrymen. The most famous Roman is almost certainly Pontius Pilate, the undistinguished governor of Judea during the reign of Tiberius. As tempting as it is to name men like Caesar, Antony, or Hadrian as the most famous Romans, one must remember that the study of the ancient past is a very niche activity, and despite our familiarity with these figures, the general public couldn't tell you the difference between Alexander the Great and Hannibal Barca. In contrast, the religion of Christianity is most certainly not a niche activity. With over 2 billion adherents worldwide, it is the most commonly practiced religion on earth, and has been for centuries. Not only does Pilate feature prominently at the very climax of all 4 gospel accounts, but he is one of the only 3 individuals mentioned by name in the Nicene Creed, which forms the basis of all Orthodox Christian practice. Every day, he is named alongside Jesus and the Virgin Mary, pretty good company, in a statement of faith that has been repeated in churches worldwide for nearly 1,700 years. Billions of people have uttered his name over the centuries and have at least a passing familiarity with his life. Unlike other notable Romans who are remembered for their own successes or failures, Pilate is remembered for a brief trial that occurred on the eve of Passover in the year 33 of the Common Era, when he condemned an itinerant preacher named Jesus of Nazareth to death by crucifixion. It is worth underscoring just how insignificant this event was to Pilate. He condemned at least 2 other men to die on that very day, and though our historical record is spotty regarding his decade as governor of Judea, we know that he had no qualms about killing any locals that agitated for an end to Roman dominance of their homeland. In fact, he would be recalled around the year 36 for his heavy-handed tactics in repressing a popular movement in the region of Samaria, after the Roman governor of Syria raised a complaint against him. One can only imagine how Pilate governed if his tactics were viewed as too brutal, even by other Romans. However, his record of brutality is likely what got him the job in the first place. His title of prefect heavily implies that his responsibilities were explicitly military in nature, and that he was not being tasked with administering a peaceful and prosperous province. His status as an equestrian and a plebeian meant that Pilate probably earned the job through a somewhat meritocratic process, where he was recognized for efficient military command earlier in his career. The fact that he governed Judea for 10 years could be a reflection of the view that from a Roman standpoint, he was good at his job, or that no one else wanted it. Maybe both. The job was undesirable because Judea was not a particularly wealthy province, which curbed the ability of governors to take lucrative bribes from local elites. In addition, Judea was one of the few remaining hotspots of provincial anti-Roman sentiment. Romans were used to sporadic uprisings occurring in provinces throughout the first generation of occupation, but as ties with Rome increased and local elites coveted Roman markets more than autonomy, this rebellious streak typically faded. But Judea had been in the Roman orbit for nearly 100 years, and the locals remained restless, necessitating a military governor for the province rather than a pampered senator looking to pad his bank account. The tension boiled down to the fundamentally incompatible worldviews of the Hebrew monotheists versus the polytheistic Romans. The distinctive religion of the Jews was incomprehensible to the Roman mind and put Pilate in a difficult position because as governor, he was also high priest of the Roman religion in the province and was expected to make sacrifices to the imperial cult. His political future, and possibly even his life, depended on honoring Tiberius as a god, and the only significant archaeological evidence that we have from his governorship is an inscription on a temple that he dedicated to the deified Tiberius in the Hellenized town of Caesarea. But the Judeans were incensed at any efforts to worship a human. The Jewish historian Josephus tells us that there were massive protests at the mere inclusion of images of Tiberius being placed on legionary standards in Jerusalem, as Jews interpreted this as a graven image, and thus a violation of the second commandment. This fundamental tension accounts for the fraught relationship between Pontius Pilate and the Jewish leadership in Jerusalem, described in the Gospel narratives. As the final judge in the province, Pilate alone had the authority to issue a sentence of capital punishment, and he appears initially reluctant to do so. His hesitance to condemn a poor itinerant preacher with no political connections does not, however, seem to mesh with our other information from Josephus and Philo that presents him as downright bloodthirsty, and some have claimed that Pilate's deferential role in the trial was an attempt by the Gospel writers to shift the blame of Jesus' death onto the Jews and away from the Romans. In my view, however, Pilate is just practicing shrewd politics, making a fuss about his supposed reluctance to kill Jesus in order to convince the Sanhedrin that they owed him for the favor. Pilate knows that he alone has the power to grant the death sentence that they seek, and is putting up a show in the hopes of extracting future concessions from a group that could serve as the focal point for a nationalist resistance movement. Furthermore, as opposed to pushing the blame onto Jews alone, the complicity of Pilate in the death of Jesus could also be seen as an effort to demonstrate that the highest institutions of Gentile and Hebrew alike had colluded in issuing the sentence, which serves as an indictment of the entire world, a message that flows naturally from the Christian belief that all are in need of redemption. Further complicating the belief that the early Christians sought to ingratiate themselves with the Romans is the degree to which Christians embraced the cross as a symbol of resistance. The image of a crucifix was a horrifying display of Rome's power, and the Christian reclamation of this instrument of death offers a window into the emerging belief that their communities were cast in opposition to Rome's brutal vision of the world. But even if we reject this as conjecture, there is no way that Pilate emerges from a reading of the Gospel accounts looking anything like a decent person. He is rushed and conniving, while at the same time haughty and foolish. John in particular seems to have it out for Pilate when he relates that Pilate asks Jesus, "What is truth?" but then leaves before even listening to the answer. Pilate's fame, or rather infamy, is a complete historical accident. He did nothing of note, and certainly nothing to commend himself, during Jesus' trial. There were likely hundreds of Romans qualified for the governorship that could have been given the job, and doubtlessly would have behaved in a very similar manner. Instead of being anonymous and lost to history, as he probably deserved, Pilate is remembered as one of the few named interlocutors of a man whose memory has shaped the world in profound ways. While it is ironic that Pilate has become the most famous Roman more for his inaction than anything else, I find it somewhat fitting as an excellent example of how we can never be precisely sure which moments and decisions will shape the legacy we leave behind, and that we ought to live accordingly.
Hi, this is Titus from Tribunet. If you enjoyed the video you just saw by Gaius, and if you're interested in thoughtful content that explores the complex culture of the ancient Romans, don't forget to hit like and subscribe.